Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back through the mists of time to a world where winter wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a test of survival. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a medieval village as the sun sinks behind bare skeletal trees. The air bites at your cheeks, and you can see your breath hanging in silvery clouds. Around you, timber cottages hunker low against the earth, their thatched roofs already dusted with the first snowflakes of evening. Smoke curls from a few chimneys, thin precious threads of warmth rising into the bruised sky. This is November in the year 1320, and you're about to discover how peasants survived nights so cold that water froze solid in wooden buckets and frost crept through every crack in the walls. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why your grandmother insists on piling blankets high, or why the idea of gathering around the hearth carries such weight in our collective memory. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or maybe share your own memories of the coldest night you've ever experienced. I'd love to hear your stories. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You pull your woolen cloak tighter as you approach the nearest cottage. The structure looks fragile against the advancing winter. Walls of wattle and daub, that ancient mixture of woven sticks and mud plaster, already showing cracks where the cold has worried at the seams. The thatch overhead sags under gathering snow. There's no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters pulled tight, and beneath the door you can see a thin line of flickering orange light. This is home for a family of 6. Thomas the ploughman, his wife Agnes, 3 children, and Thomas's elderly mother, who sits closest to the fire because her bones ache with what we'd now call arthritis. You duck through the low doorway. Medieval peasants were shorter than us, and these entrances were built to keep heat in and cold out. The smell hits you immediately. Smoke, unwashed bodies, damp straw, and something cooking in an iron pot. Your eyes adjust to the dimness. The cottage is a single room, maybe 20 feet by 15, and it contains everything this family owns. In the centre, the hearth glows with a small fire, smaller than you'd expect because fuel is precious and winter is long. Along the walls, rough wooden platforms serve as beds, piled with straw and whatever fabric the family could gather. A cow shifts in the far corner, its warmth a calculated part of the household's survival strategy. Thomas looks up from where he's banking the fire of the night, adding just enough wood to keep it alive until morning, but not so much that tomorrow will find them with empty hands and cold ashes. He nods at you. A stranger arriving at nightfall is unusual, but not unheard of in this close-knit world, where hospitality is both Christian duty and insurance policy. After all, you never know when you might be the one seeking shelter. The temperature outside is dropping fast. By modern measurements, it's already hovering around 28 degrees Fahrenheit and falling toward the teens. Inside, near the fire, it might reach a generous 50 degrees. In the sleeping areas along the walls, you'd be lucky to feel 40 degrees by midnight. There's no insulation in these walls, just mud, sticks and hope. The wind finds every gap, every poorly chinked seam, and the cold seeps through like water through a sieve. Agnes is settling the children for sleep, wrapping them in layers you'll soon understand intimately. The youngest, barely 3 years old, whimpers about the cold. His mother pulls him close, and you notice how naturally she positions her body as a windbreak between him and the drafty wall. Medieval mothers knew secrets about survival that no book recorded. The angle at which to hold a child to share maximum warmth, the way to tuck fabric to trap heat, the songs that distracted from discomfort. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually felt the cold less intensely than we would. Their bodies perhaps adapted through generations of exposure, or if each winter night was simply endured through sheer, gritted teeth necessity. The answer probably lies somewhere in between. They were tougher, certainly, their bodies hardened by outdoor labour and constant physical demands, but they also suffered, died, and feared the cold in ways we can barely imagine. You watch as Thomas's mother inches closer to the hearth, her gnarled hands stretched toward the flames. She's maybe 55 years old, ancient by medieval standards, and she's survived perhaps 40 harsh winters. Each one has left its mark, fingers slightly twisted from old frostbite, a persistent cough from decades of breathing smoke-filled air, a wariness in her eyes when she looks at the door, as if calculating how many hours until dawn. The fire pops and settles. Outside you hear wind beginning to pick up, moaning through the village like something alive and hungry. This is just the beginning of the night, and already you can feel the cold pressing against the walls, testing for weakness, seeking entry. The family is preparing for a 12-hour siege of darkness and dropping temperatures, armed with nothing but fire, fabric, and each other's warmth. You settle onto a pile of straw near the wall, pulling a rough blanket over yourself. The straw prickles through your clothing, but you quickly understand its purpose, its insulation, trapping pockets of air between you and the frozen ground. Through a gap in the shutters, you can see snow beginning to fall more heavily now, thick flakes swirling in the darkness. This is going to be a long night, and you're about to learn exactly how medieval peasants endured it. The fire is everything. As you lie there in the straw, watching Thomas carefully position 3 more logs on the coals, you begin to understand that this small pile of burning wood represents the difference between life and death. In the medieval world, fire wasn't just comfort, it was survival's beating heart. And keeping it alive through a winter night required knowledge passed down through generations like a sacred text. Thomas moves with the precision of a ritual. He's banking the fire, a technique that would seem counterintuitive to us modern folk who think bigger flames mean more warmth. Instead, he's creating a slow, steady burn that will last until dawn. He arranges the logs in a careful pattern, leaving just enough air for combustion, but not so much that the wood blazes through in wasteful enthusiasm. Then he does something that looks almost like burial. He rakes ashes over parts of the burning wood, smothering it just enough to slow the burn. In the morning he'll reverse this process, uncovering the embers and coaxing them back to full flame with kindling and breath. You watch Agnes sprinkle something from a small cloth bag onto the fire. It's salt. Here's your quirky historical tidbit for the night. Some medieval peasants believed that salt in the fire would keep evil spirits away and prevent the flames from dying too quickly. Whether it actually affected the fire's chemistry is debatable, but the ritual gave comfort, and comfort on a freezing night had its own value. Plus, the moisture in the salt created a brief, satisfying hiss that sounded like the fire fighting back against the cold. The logs Thomas burns tonight are oak, saved specifically for the coldest nights. During autumn, he spent every spare hour gathering deadfall from the Lord's forest. Technically illegal, but enforced with varying degrees of strictness depending on how harsh the winter looked to be. A truly brutal winter meant the Lord's foresters looked the other way more often. Understanding that frozen peasants couldn't work spring fields, Thomas has a hidden cache of wood stacked behind the cottage, covered with old thatch to keep it dry. He counts those logs like a miser counts coins, calculating 50 more nights of real cold, 20 if he stretches it thin, death if he miscalculates. The smoke from the fire doesn't go up a proper chimney because this cottage doesn't have one. Instead, it rises through a hole in the thatch roof, though much of it lingers in the upper part of the room, creating a perpetual haze. Your eyes water slightly, and you understand why medieval peasants often suffered from respiratory problems. But the smoke has an unexpected benefit. It cures the thatch, preserving it against rot and helping to seal small gaps where cold might penetrate. Everything in this world serves double or triple purposes, waste being a luxury only the rich can afford. You notice that Thomas positions himself between the fire and his family, his body acting as a reflector to push heat toward the sleeping platforms. Medieval peasants understood radiant heat in practical, physical ways we've forgotten in our centrally heated world. They knew that heat travels in straight lines from its source, that bodies can block and redirect it, that stones placed near fire will hold warmth long after flames die. Thomas has several large river stones nestled in the coals right now, and before everyone settles for the night, he'll wrap them in rags and place them among the sleeping children, medieval hot water bottles that will radiate precious warmth for hours. The fire crackles and you count perhaps 8 flames dancing above the logs, each one a small miracle of chemistry and carefully hoarded fuel. In wealthier homes, fires blazed high and hot, consuming wood with aristocratic indifference. But here, in this peasant cottage, every flame is measured against tomorrow's need. Let the fire go out completely, and you face a grim morning choice. Walk to a neighbour to beg hot coals for rekindling, or spend an hour with flint and steel, numb fingers struggling to create spark and tinder while your family shivers in the dark. Historians still argue whether the medieval warm period, a span of centuries before 1300 when Europe enjoyed relatively mild temperatures, made peasants complacent about fire management, so when the Little Ice Age began creeping in after 1300, they were caught unprepared. The truth is probably more complex. Certainly the winters of the early 1300s seemed to strike with unprecedented fury, and the chronicles from monasteries record years when rivers froze solid and snow fell in May. But peasants have never been complacent about survival. More likely they simply found themselves fighting a climate that was shifting beneath their feet, requiring new strategies for increasingly hostile cold. Agnes moves to the fire now, checking the pot that hangs from an iron hook. Inside, a thin pottage of barley and turnips bubbles slowly. She'll leave it there all night, the fire's warmth keeping it from freezing, and in the morning it will provide a warm breakfast that helps stoke everyone's internal furnaces for the day ahead. Nothing is wasted. Even overnight, the fire works, cooking, warming, keeping the darkness at bay in more ways than one. You feel the fire's warmth on your face now, though your back remains cold against the wall. This is the medieval reality. You're never warm all over, never comfortable in the modern sense. Instead, you rotate like a rotisserie chicken, warming front, then back, then front again, constantly seeking the mathematical angle that maximizes heat exposure while minimizing cold spots. The children do this instinctively, shifting in their sleep, always turning toward the fire, away from the walls. The cow in the corner lows softly, and Thomas glances at it with satisfaction. That animal isn't just future labour and milk. Tonight it's a 500-pound heating unit, its metabolism turning hay into precious BTUs that warm the cottage's air by perhaps 3 or 4 degrees. You'd think the smell would be unbearable, and by modern standards it is, but scent is a small price for warmth when frostbite lurks outside your door. As the night deepens, Thomas makes one final check of the fire. He adds a single log, just one, carefully chosen for its density and slow-burning properties. This log, he explains to his eldest son in quiet tones, must last 4 hours. The boy nods solemnly. He's learning. In a few years he'll be the one calculating burn rates and banking coals, carrying forward this essential knowledge that means survival. The fire settles into its overnight rhythm. Flames lower now, more glow than blaze. It's mesmerizing, this small pool of light and warmth in an ocean of winter darkness. You understand, watching it, why humans have always gathered around flames, why fire appears in every culture's mythology as gift, as God, as the thing that separates us from beasts. Here in this cottage on this frozen night, fire is all of those things, and tomorrow's hope banked in ash and ember. Now you're learning about layers, and the medieval approach to clothing at night becomes a masterclass in heat retention that modern sleepwear companies have only begun to rediscover. Agnes is wrapping the youngest child, and you count the layers as they go on. First, the linen undertunic he's been wearing all day, unwashed because water is frozen and soap is scarce. Over that, a woolen tunic, scratchy and thick, the lanolin still present in the fibres because medieval washing was more about beating fabric against rocks than achieving any modern standard of cleanliness. Then wool leggings, hand-knitted with uneven stitches but functional nonetheless. Over everything, a larger woolen cloak that Agnes tucks around his small body like a cocoon. The genius of wool reveals itself on nights like this. Unlike linen or cotton, wool retains heat even when damp, and everything is slightly damp in a medieval cottage, from breath condensation and cooking steam, and the general humidity of 6 humans and a cow sharing close quarters. The wool fibres trap air in their crimped structure, creating thousands of tiny insulating pockets. Medieval peasants didn't understand the science, but they understood the results. Sheep's wool kept you alive when other fabrics failed. You watch Thomas pull on an extra layer himself, a leather jerkin worn smooth with age, stiff with cold until his body heat softens it. Leather is his luxury, earned through extra labour last harvest. It blocks wind like nothing else, and on a night when drafts snake through every wall crack, wind blocking is survival. He keeps his woolen hood on too, because here's something we've forgotten. You lose tremendous heat through your head. Medieval peasants knew this instinctively, and they kept their heads covered indoors and out day and night, sacrificing vanity for warmth without a second thought. Agnes now does something that might make modern people uncomfortable but made perfect medieval sense. She's arranging the family for sleeping, and bodies are going to touch. Lots of bodies. The eldest daughter, maybe 10 years old, lies down first on the sleeping platform. The middle child, a boy of 7, nestles against her back. The youngest goes against his chest. Agnes lies behind the eldest daughter, creating a human sandwich of warmth. Thomas will join them shortly, forming the outer layer, his larger body blocking drafts from the wall. Thomas's mother gets her own sleeping space closer to the fire, partly out of respect for her age, partly because her poor circulation means she needs more direct heat. This communal sleeping arrangement was standard practice among medieval peasants, and historians still argue whether it created psychological benefits beyond the obvious thermal ones. Did this enforced closeness strengthen family bonds, or was it simply endured as necessity? Probably both. You can see affection in how Agnes positions the children, making sure the smallest is most protected, but you can also see in Thomas's face the weary acceptance of someone who hasn't slept alone or comfortably in years. But here's where it gets really interesting, and slightly odder by modern standards. Some peasant families would strip down to their undergarments for sleep, sharing body heat more efficiently skin to skin beneath piled blankets and furs. Others, particularly in the coldest regions, did the opposite. They wore more clothes to bed than during the day, layering everything they owned onto their bodies. Both strategies worked depending on what resources you had. A family with good blankets and furs could afford to wear less. A family with thin coverings needed every thread on their bodies. You notice the blankets now, and that's a generous term for what's actually a mix of worn woolen cloth, old cloaks past their outdoor usefulness, and several rabbit furs stitched together into a lumpy covering. There's also straw, lots of it, both beneath and over the family. They'll literally burrow into it like mice, creating nests that trap warmth. In the morning, everyone will emerge with straw in their hair and impressions on their skin, but they'll emerge alive. Agnes produces something from the wooden chest, a fox fur, reddish and somewhat mangy but thick. This goes over the youngest child specifically, tucked around his head and shoulders. Fox fur was prized by peasants who could get it, usually through poaching in the Lord's forest or trading with someone who had. A single good fur could mean the difference between a child surviving winter or succumbing to what medieval records blandly called cold sickness, probably pneumonia or hypothermia-related complications. The family also practices something you might find surprising. They leave their stockings on. Medieval wisdom held that keeping feet warm kept the whole body warm, and they weren't wrong. Your extremities are where you lose heat fastest, and frozen feet can lead to frostbite, which leads to infection, which often leads to death in a world without antibiotics. So the stockings stay on, wool against skin, possibly unchanged for weeks because washing in winter is nearly impossible. Here's your quirky detail. Some peasants would rub their feet with animal fat before bed. Goose grease was popular, believing it sealed in warmth and prevented cold from entering through the skin. Whether it actually helped or just made their stockings disgustingly greasy is lost to history, but the practice was common enough that medieval medical texts mention it. The placebo effect alone might have been valuable. Feeling like you're doing something to fight the cold matters when cold feels infinite. Thomas now wraps a long woolen scarf around his neck and lower face, leaving just his eyes exposed. He looks like a medieval bandit, but he's practicing another piece of survival wisdom, warming the air you breathe before it hits your lungs. Cold air in the lungs all night can lead to coughing, congestion and sickness. By breathing through wool, he warms and humidifies each breath slightly, giving his body one less battle to fight. You pull your own borrowed blanket tighter and realise you're instinctively curling into a ball, minimising your surface area to conserve heat. This is exactly what the medieval body learned to do. Make yourself small, tuck in your extremities, become a heat-conserving sphere rather than a heat-radiating sprawl. The family on the sleeping platform looks like a multi-person organism now, indistinguishable lumps under layers of fabric and fur, breathing in synchronized rhythm. Agnes does one final thing before settling completely. She takes hot stones from the fire, the ones Thomas prepared earlier, now wrapped in rags, and distributes them strategically. One goes near the children's feet, another near Thomas's mother's back. The last she keeps for herself, clutching it against her stomach. These stones will stay warm for hours, little islands of heat in the cold night sea. The layering is complete. The family is ready. Outside, the temperature continues its relentless drop, but inside, wrapped in wool and fur and each other's warmth, the family has created a microclimate. Fragile, imperfect, but enough. You close your eyes and feel the scratch of wool against your neck, smell the lanolin and smoke and humanity, and understand that comfort in the medieval world wasn't about luxury. It was about making it until morning. The sleeping arrangements you've just witnessed represent just one family's strategy, but step back and look at the broader picture of medieval peasant dwellings, and you'll discover that the entire concept of the longhouse was essentially a survival machine designed around shared warmth. In regions across medieval Europe, from England to Scandinavia to parts of France, peasants didn't just share sleeping spaces within families. They shared them with multiple families and always with their animals. You're experiencing this now in Thomas's cottage, but imagine it amplified. In many villages, particularly in the harshest climates, longhouses stretched 40 or 50 feet, with humans at one end and livestock at the other, and only a partial partition between. Sometimes there was no partition at all, just a communal understanding that this end is for people, that end is for beasts, and the warm air circulates throughout. The medieval longhouse was essentially a symbiotic heating system, where every living thing's metabolism contributed to the collective survival. The cow you've been hearing shift and breathe in the corner isn't just tolerated, she's essential. A single cow produces approximately the same heat as a 1,000-watt space heater through simple digestion and metabolism. Her body temperature runs around 101 degrees Fahrenheit, and in this enclosed space that warmth radiates outward, mixing with the heat from human bodies and the fire to create a survivable atmosphere. On the coldest nights, peasants measured the temperature not with thermometers, which didn't exist for them, but with ice. If the water bucket in the corner froze solid, it was a dangerous night. If it stayed liquid, the combined body heat was winning. Do you remember how Thomas positioned that cow? She's not randomly placed. She's against the north wall, the one that takes the brunt of the prevailing winter wind. Her massive body acts as insulation, a living windbreak that absorbs the worst of the cold before it penetrates deeper into the cottage. Medieval peasants understood building science through trial and error. Cold comes from specific directions, and you position your warmest assets, animals, stored grain, piled wood, as barriers against it. In larger longhouses, you might find not just one cow, but several, plus sheep, goats, sometimes pigs, all clustered at one end, creating a barnyard microclimate that kept the human end survivable. The smell must have been extraordinary, and by extraordinary, I mean probably unbearable by our standards. The ammonia from animal urine alone would make your eyes water, but medieval noses were different from ours, accustomed to stenches we'd find intolerable. And besides, you can't smell when you're dead from freezing, so the choice was clear. Here's something historians still argue about. Did this constant proximity to animals contribute to disease transmission? Or did it actually help build immune systems that protected peasants from certain illnesses? The evidence goes both ways. Certainly, zoonotic diseases, those jumping from animals to humans, were a real threat. But some scholars suggest that constant low-level exposure to animal pathogens might have provided a kind of immunity training. The medieval peasant immune system was a battle-hardened warrior, and perhaps all those cows and sheep in the sleeping quarters were part of the training regimen. The sleeping huddle you're witnessing now has an even deeper biological logic. When humans sleep in close proximity, their breathing synchronizes, which might sound like New Age nonsense but is actually documented science. This synchronization may help regulate body temperature across the group. When one person's metabolism dips and they start to cool, the warmth from adjacent bodies compensates. Medieval families didn't know the science, but they knew that sleeping alone on a cold night was dangerous, that even the most disagreeable relative became precious when frost painted the inside of the walls. Thomas's mother, lying near the fire, represents another aspect of longhouse survival strategy, the positioning of the most vulnerable. Children and the elderly got the warmest spots not entirely out of kindness, though affection played a role, but because they were most likely to die from cold, and every death weakened the family unit. A medieval family was an economic system, and each member contributed labour or wisdom. Losing someone to winter meant harder times for everyone who remained. You watch as one of the children, the middle boy, unconsciously shifts in his sleep, pressing closer to his sister. This isn't just seeking warmth, it's something deeper, more primal. Humans are tropical creatures, evolved for African heat, and winter in medieval Europe was a hostile environment our bodies weren't designed for. Huddling together is coded in our DNA, a behaviour we share with emperor penguins and wolf packs, and every other creature that survives cold through cooperation. The straw beneath everyone serves multiple purposes you're beginning to appreciate. It's insulation from the frozen earth below, critical because the ground itself becomes a heat sink in winter, pulling warmth from any body touching it. But the straw is also home to other creatures, mice, insects, sometimes rats. A medieval peasant's relationship with vermin was complex. They were annoying, certainly, and they ate stored grain, but they were also warm-blooded heat sources, and their presence in the straw added fractionally to the room's warmth. Plus, the cat that many families kept, ostensibly for mouse control, usually slept with the family, adding its own small furnace of heat to the pile. Agnes has positioned herself at the edge of the family huddle, and you notice she's the one most exposed to the room's cold air. This is the mother's burden across centuries. She takes the worst position so her children can have the best. Medieval mothers calculated warmth in degrees of sacrifice, measuring love in the inches they position themselves from the fire versus where they place their babies. The breathing in the room now creates a rhythm, 7 humans and 1 cow, each exhale adding moisture and carbon dioxide to the air, each inhale taking what oxygen remains. The cottage is sealed tight against the cold, which means ventilation is almost zero. By morning, the air will be stale and thick, oxygen depleted and heavy with the night's accumulated breath. Some scholars suggest this contributed to the grogginess medieval people often felt at dawn, their brains slightly starved for oxygen after a night in sealed quarters. But again, the choice was clear: stuffy air versus frozen death. Here's your quirky detail: some families would bring chickens inside on the coldest nights, keeping them in baskets near the sleeping area. Chickens, despite their small size, produce surprising amounts of heat. A hen's body temperature runs about 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Plus, their morning crowing served as an alarm clock, and their eggs were breakfast. Everything in the medieval world stacked functions, necessity being the mother of efficiency. Thomas shifts slightly, and you hear his breathing deepen as he falls towards sleep. Around him, his family settles into the night's long endurance. They're a single organism now, this huddle of humanity and livestock and straw, a warm island in a frozen world, breathing together, surviving together, counting the hours until dawn's first light means the fire can be rebuilt and another night has been won. The darkness is what strikes you now, as the fire burns lower and the last of the daylight has long since vanished beyond the shuttered windows. This isn't the darkness you know from a modern life, the kind you can banish with a finger on a light switch, or even the ambient glow of streetlights bleeding through curtains. This is complete, absolute, primal darkness, the kind that presses against your eyeballs and makes you question whether they're even open. Welcome to the medieval night where illumination was earned drop by precious drop, and most hours were simply surrendered to blackness. The family's main source of light after sunset, besides the fire itself, is a rushlight, and Agnes has just lit one from an ember. You watch as the small flame catches, and suddenly there's a tiny pool of orange light in the darkness. No brighter than a birthday candle, but precious beyond measure. A rushlight is brilliantly simple and desperately inadequate. You take the common rush plant that grows in marshy areas, peel away most of the outer green skin to expose the inner pith, then soak that pith in animal fat, tallow usually rendered from sheep or pigs. The fat-soaked pith burns slowly, giving off a small flame that provides just enough light to navigate the room without breaking your neck on the furniture. Thomas has a small holder for the rushlight, just a metal clip attached to a stone base, and he positions it carefully on a shelf away from the straw bedding. Fire discipline is everything in a world of thatch and wood and fabric. One careless moment, one knocked over rushlight, and the entire cottage becomes an inferno. Medieval village records are full of tragic entries. The house of John Miller burned and his wife and 2 children with it. So the rushlight burns, but it burns where someone's watching, and it burns for only as long as absolutely necessary. Here's the mathematics of medieval lighting that would horrify us. A single rushlight burns for perhaps 15 to 30 minutes, depending on thickness and how well it was prepared. To light a cottage for a full evening, say 4 hours, you'd need 8 to 16 rushlights. Each rushlight requires gathering rushes, peeling them, rendering tallow, dipping the pith and drying it. The labour is substantial, the result is minimal, so most peasant families simply didn't bother lighting their evenings. They rose with the sun and went to bed shortly after it set, living their lives according to natural light because artificial light was too expensive in both labour and resources. Wealthier peasants, those with a bit more land or a profitable sidecraft, might afford tallow candles, which burned brighter and longer than rushlights. A tallow candle was a status symbol in the medieval village, something you'd light for special occasions or when you really needed to work after dark. But tallow candles smoked terribly, filling the cottage with greasy fumes that smelled of rendered animal fat, because that's exactly what they were, and they were still dim by our standards. You'd need 10 tallow candles to approximate a modern 60-watt bulb. Beeswax candles were the gold standard, burning cleaner and brighter with a pleasant honey scent, but they were so expensive that peasants almost never saw them. Beeswax was for churches and nobles, for illuminating prayer books and great halls. A peasant might smell beeswax once a year at Christmas Mass and remember it as a fleeting luxury, like tasting wine when your daily drink is weak ale. So Thomas's family does what most medieval peasants did. They embrace the darkness. After the evening meal and the necessary preparations for sleep, they simply lie down and close their eyes, surrendering to the night 12 or 14 hours before dawn. In winter, when darkness came at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, peasants might be in bed by 6, rising again around 6 in the morning. That's 12 hours of horizontal time, though not all of it was sleep. Historians still argue whether this created a different sleep pattern than modern humans experience, what some call segmented sleep, or first sleep and second sleep. The theory suggests medieval people slept for 3 or 4 hours, then woke for an hour or two in the middle of the night before sleeping again until dawn. During that wakeful period, they might pray, tend the fire, talk quietly, or engage in marital intimacy. Some scholars find evidence for this pattern in medieval literature and legal records. Others argue it was just one of many sleep patterns that varied by individual and circumstance. You're experiencing the darkness now as hours pass. The rushlight has long since burned out and the fire has settled into glowing coals that provide almost no illumination, just a faint red suggestion in the blackness. Your other senses sharpen in compensation. You hear everything, the wind outside, a shutter rattling, someone's breath catching in their throat, the cow shifting her weight, straw rustling as a child turns over. Smell becomes acute. Smoke and wool and body's an animal. Touch is everything, the scratch of your blanket, the cold air on your exposed cheek, the relative warmth near your core. This sensory deprivation, or rather this sensory shift, was the nightly reality for medieval peasants. They existed in darkness for half or more of their lives, navigating by memory and touch, learning the geography of their homes so thoroughly that they could move through absolute blackness without hesitation. Children learned this early, where every piece of furniture stood, where the fire pit was, where the door, where the sleeping platforms. Darkness wasn't scary. It was just reality. But here's the thing about human eyes. They adapt. After 20 or 30 minutes in near total darkness, your pupils dilate to their maximum, and you start to see things you didn't think possible. The faint glow from the banked coals becomes enough to make out shapes. Starlight leaking through tiny gaps in the shutters provides the faintest illumination. Your brain fills in details from memory, creating a mental map that feels almost like seeing. Medieval people lived half their lives in this twilight state, neither blind nor seeing, navigating a dim world that we've forgotten ever existed. The psychological impact of all this darkness is something we can barely imagine. Without electric light, without even reliable candles, the night was a vast, unknown territory. Anything could be happening outside your walls: thieves, wolves, evil spirits, the devil himself, according to medieval belief. The darkness held dangers both real and imagined, and there was no way to check except opening your door and stepping into that blackness, which no sensible person would do. So you stayed inside in your cocoon of family and warmth, and you surrendered to the night. The darkness became a companion, familiar and almost comforting in its predictability. Every night was dark, every morning brought light. This rhythm was as reliable as anything in the medieval world, perhaps more reliable than food or health or peace. The sun rose, the sun set, darkness fell, dawn came. You could count on it. Agnes murmurs something in her sleep, and you hear Thomas respond quietly, though you can't see either of them in the blackness. Just voices in the dark, proof that you're not alone. And maybe that was the real function of the family huddle. Not just warmth, but the comfort of presence. The reassurance of other humans breathing nearby when the world outside was cold and dark and infinite. The rushlight is gone, the fire is low, the darkness is complete. But you're not afraid, not really. You're just waiting for morning like every peasant before you, counting the hours in the dark. Your stomach rumbles in the darkness, and you realise you haven't thought much about food since arriving at the cottage. But now, several hours into this cold night, hunger makes itself known. Food in the medieval winter wasn't just about satisfying appetite, it was fuel, quite literally, for the internal fires that kept bodies warm. And what peasants ate, especially on the coldest nights, tells a story about survival that equal parts ingenuity and desperation. The pottage that Agnes left hanging over the coals is still there, barely simmering, its contents a thick stew that represents the baseline of peasant nutrition. If you could see it in daylight, you'd notice it's more grey than appetising, a glutinous mass of barley, turnips, onions if the family is lucky, and perhaps a bone or two from last autumn's pig slaughter, boiled so many times that any flavour has long since departed, leaving only the memory of meat. But here's what matters. It's hot, and hot food on a cold night is a gift from God himself. Medieval peasants understood something about thermodynamics that we've mostly forgotten in our climate-controlled world. Eating raises your body temperature. Digestion itself is a metabolic process that generates heat, and certain foods do this more efficiently than others. Grains and starches, the foundation of the peasant diet, burn slowly in your belly, providing sustained warmth over hours. It's why Agnes made sure everyone ate a bowl of pottage before bed, and why she'll serve it again at dawn. That warmth you feel in your stomach after eating isn't just satisfaction, it's actual heat being generated by your digestive system, radiating outward through your body. The family's winter diet is relentlessly monotonous. Grain, grain and more grain, with occasional vegetables from root cellars when they haven't rotted. Barley is the workhorse grain, cheaper than wheat, hardier, capable of growing in poor soil and short summers. They eat it as porridge, as bread when they can afford to have it ground and baked, as thickener in stews, as the base of thin ale that's safer to drink than water. A single family might consume hundreds of pounds of barley over a winter, each grain a tiny packet of calories that stands between them and starvation. But here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some peasants deliberately ate certain foods before bed because they believed these foods generated more internal heat. Onions and leeks were considered warming foods in medieval medical theory, part of a complex system of hot and cold, wet and dry humours that governed medieval understanding of nutrition. Whether onions actually generate more heat than, say, turnips is scientifically questionable, but they do contain compounds that increase circulation slightly, which might create a sensation of warmth. And again, belief matters. If you think you're warmer, you might endure the cold more patiently. Thomas's family is relatively fortunate. They still have food. By late winter, many peasant families were scraping the bottoms of their grain sacks, mixing sawdust with flour to stretch it further, or eating famine bread made from acorns, bark, and anything else that could be ground into a powder and wouldn't immediately poison you. Hunger and cold make terrible partners. Your body needs more calories to generate heat in cold weather, but winter is precisely when food is scarcest. It's a cruel mathematics that killed countless medieval peasants every year. The family's protein sources are limited this time of year. The pig they slaughtered in November has been carefully rationed, most of it salted and hanging in the coldest part of the cottage to slow spoilage. On special nights, perhaps once a week, Agnes might add a bit of salt pork to the pottage, flavouring the whole pot with precious fat and meat. Fat is especially valuable in winter because it's calorie-dense, meaning it provides maximum fuel for your internal furnace with minimum volume. A spoonful of lard contains more than twice the calories of a spoonful of barley, and on the coldest nights, Agnes might give each child a small piece of fat to chew. Not tasty by modern standards, but warming in ways that matter. Do you remember the cow in the corner? She's not just a heat source, she's also milk. Though her production has dropped dramatically in winter, when fresh grass is absent and she's living on hay and grain scraps. Still, what milk she gives is precious. It can be made into cheese that stores well, or mixed into the pottage for added richness, or simply drunk as is, providing fat and protein and warmth. In the coldest weeks, peasants sometimes warmed milk over the fire and drank it hot before bed, a medieval version of comfort food that actually did provide measurable warmth. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants suffered from specific nutritional deficiencies that made them more vulnerable to cold. Certainly vitamin C was scarce in winter when fresh fruits and vegetables disappeared, which led to scurvy in extreme cases. Vitamin D, generated by sun exposure, dropped dramatically during the short dark winter days, potentially weakening bones and immune systems. But the human body is remarkably adaptable, and peasants who survived childhood, already a significant filter, were often toughened by nutritional deprivation in ways that seem almost superhuman by our coddled modern standards. Bread, when available, was a different substance than what we know. Medieval peasant bread was dense, dark, and often gritty with bits of millstone that had ground off during the flour-making process. It might be days or even weeks old, hard enough to break teeth, but soaked in pottage or ale, it became edible and filling. A large loaf of bread might last a family several days, rationed carefully, each piece a measured quantity of calories. On the coldest nights, some families would toast their bread by the fire before eating it, partly to soften it, partly because hot food, even hot bread, warms you in ways cold food cannot. The ale that nearly everyone drank, including children, was a weak, nutritious beverage made from fermented grain. It provided calories and was safer than water, which might carry diseases. In winter, some families warmed their ale by the fire, creating a hot beverage that served the same warming function as hot chocolate or coffee does for us. The alcohol content was low, just enough to preserve it and provide a tiny bit of caloric value, not enough to cause intoxication unless you drank enormous quantities. Agnes has a small store of dried herbs, thyme, sage, perhaps some dried mint, that she adds to the pottage not just for flavour but because medieval medical wisdom held that herbs aided digestion and promoted health. Whether they actually did anything is debatable, but the placebo effect is real, and belief in the healing power of herbs might have provided psychological comfort that translated into physical resilience. Plus, they made the monotonous pottage taste like something other than grey mush, which surely improved morale on long winter nights. You lie there in the darkness, feeling the faint warmth from the evening meal still present in your belly, understanding now why Agnes insisted everyone eat before bed. That warmth is your night companion, your internal fire burning alongside the external one, both fighting the same enemy. The cold presses in from all sides, but inside, in your core where the barley and turnips are slowly breaking down, there's heat, purchased with the labour of last summer's harvest and carefully hoarded through winter's long siege. Your stomach gurgles softly, digestion continuing its invisible work, and you pull the blanket tighter, grateful for every calorie. Morning will come eventually, but before it does, you need to understand what happens when the cold wins, when despite all the fires and furs and huddling, the freezing temperatures penetrate flesh and do their damage. The human body on a medieval winter night is engaged in constant warfare, and sometimes it loses battles. You're about to witness the brutal toll of winter and the strange, desperate remedies peasants employed when cold turned from discomfort to danger. Thomas's mother shifts near the fire, and even in the darkness you hear her wince. Her hands are troubling her again. Chilblains, the medieval curse that afflicted almost everyone who lived through harsh winters. Chilblains occur when small blood vessels in your extremities constrict in response to cold, then suddenly expand when you warm them too quickly by the fire. The result is painful, itchy, swollen patches of skin, usually on fingers, toes and ears. They burn and ache simultaneously, and in severe cases they can ulcerate and become infected. Agnes will treat her mother-in-law's chilblains in the morning with a remedy passed down through generations. She'll mix egg white with honey and perhaps a bit of crushed chamomile, applying it to the affected areas and wrapping them in clean linen. Does it work? Historians still argue about the efficacy of medieval folk remedies. Some contained genuinely useful ingredients. Honey is naturally antibacterial, for instance, while others were pure superstition. But the act of treatment itself provided comfort, and the placebo effect shouldn't be dismissed, especially when actual medical help was non-existent for peasants. The children are more vulnerable than adults, their smaller bodies losing heat faster, their circulation less efficient. You notice how Agnes checks them periodically through the night, even in darkness, her hands finding their cheeks to assess warmth, feeling for the dangerous coolness that signals a body losing its thermal battle. Medieval mothers developed a tactile literacy of temperature, reading their children's survival chances through fingertips in the dark. Frostbite is the more serious threat, and Thomas knows its signs well. He lost a cousin to it 10 winters ago. The man fell through ice while fetching water, couldn't get dry quickly enough, and his feet froze. Within days they'd turned black. Within weeks infection had spread, and the man died screaming. Actual frostbite, where tissue freezes solid, was less common inside cottages than you might think, because the combination of fire, body heat and animals usually kept temperatures just above freezing. But outside, or in poorly heated shelters, or during the worst storms, frostbite claimed fingers, toes, noses and ears with casual cruelty. The medieval treatment for frostbite was almost worse than the condition. The standard remedy involved rubbing the affected area with snow or ice, based on the theory that you should warm frozen flesh gradually. This is actually not terrible advice. Rapid rewarming can cause more damage. But peasants would also apply bizarre remedies. Goose grease mixed with turpentine, poultices made from bread and urine, or even the blood of freshly killed animals. Some remedies likely helped by providing a protective barrier against infection. Others probably hastened tissue death. Medieval medicine was a lottery where survival often depended on luck as much as treatment. Here's your quirky detail that sounds absurd but was surprisingly common. Some peasants believed that burying frostbitten limbs in snow or frozen earth would draw out the cold like extracting venom from a snake bite. They'd literally dig holes in snowbanks and insert their frozen hands or feet, leaving them there for hours. The logic was backwards. Cold doesn't work like poison that can be sucked out, but the practice was widespread enough that medical texts felt compelled to address it, usually to condemn it as foolishness that caused more amputations than it prevented. You hear one of the children coughing, a wet rattling sound that Agnes immediately responds to, even half asleep. Respiratory illness was winter's other weapon, and in a sealed cottage full of smoke and stale air and multiple breathing bodies, infections spread efficiently. The cough could be nothing, or it could be the beginning of pneumonia, which killed with terrifying speed in a world without antibiotics. Agnes will make an herbal tea in the morning, thyme and honey and perhaps some horehound if she has it, that will soothe the throat but do little against actual bacterial infection. Medieval peasants had a concept they called taking cold, believing that cold itself could enter the body and cause illness. We now know that cold doesn't cause disease. Viruses and bacteria do, but cold does suppress immune function and make infection more likely. So the medieval understanding, while scientifically wrong, was functionally correct. Prolonged exposure to cold made you sick, and staying warm was the best prevention. The fear of night air was real and reasonable in medieval minds. Cold night air was thought to carry disease, which is why they sealed every gap in the cottage. This created its own problems. The air quality was terrible, oxygen depleted, carbon dioxide elevated, perfect conditions for spreading respiratory infections. But the alternative was freezing, and freezing was more immediately dangerous than bad air. Medieval survival was always about choosing between different types of suffering. Thomas's mother also suffers from what we'd recognise as arthritis, joint pain and stiffness that worsens dramatically in cold, damp conditions. Medieval people called it the joint evil, or sometimes just the cold ache, and they treated it with warming poultices, heated stones placed against painful joints, and various herbal preparations. Willow bark tea, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, was sometimes used and actually provided genuine pain relief, though medieval peasants didn't understand why. They just knew it helped, and that was enough. The mental toll of winter is harder to document, but was surely significant. Imagine months of confinement, short days, long nights, constant cold, monotonous food, and the ever-present threat of death. What we'd now call seasonal affective disorder must have been epidemic, though medieval people had no name for it. They just endured the winter melancholy, the irritability, the sense of being trapped, because there was no alternative. Some scholars suggest that medieval people's acceptance of suffering, their apparent ability to endure hardships that would break modern people, was partly cultural conditioning, but also partly because they had no framework for believing life could be different. Agnes keeps a small collection of dried herbs, not just for cooking but for various ailments. Mint for stomach troubles, sage for sore throats, nettle for general weakness, and a carefully hoarded supply of feverfew for headaches and the fevers that gave it its name. Whether these herbs actually worked is debatable. Some had genuine medicinal properties, others were placebo at best. But the ritual of treatment, the sense of doing something against the cold and its consequences, had value beyond pharmacology. One child whimpers in sleep, and you wonder if he's dreaming of summer, of warm sun and green fields and the simple pleasure of not being cold. Or perhaps medieval children didn't even dream of warmth. Perhaps they simply accepted cold as life's baseline and only occasionally remembered that warmth existed. The psychological adaptation required to survive medieval winter might have included lowering your expectations until mere survival felt like victory. The night stretches on, and bodies fight their small, invisible battles against cold. Circulation struggles to keep extremities warm. Immune systems wage war against respiratory infections. Joints ache with the deep cold that settles into bones. This is winter's true cost. Not just the dramatic deaths from freezing or starvation, but the accumulated small damages, the chronic pains, the shortened lifespans, the bodies worn down by annual cycles of extreme cold. You lie there, relatively warm in your borrowed blanket, and understand that surviving winter meant more than just making it to morning. It meant enduring with a body that would remember this cold in its bones for all the mornings to come. The darkness has weight now, pressing down with the density of deep winter, and you realise you've been lying here for what feels like an eternity, though it's probably only been 6 or 7 hours. But these aren't just any hours of any night. You're in the depths of December, approaching the winter solstice, when nights stretch to their absolute longest and hope feels thinnest. Welcome to the coldest, darkest period of the medieval year, when survival becomes as much a psychological battle as a physical one. The winter solstice, falling around December 21st, marked the point when darkness reached its maximum grip on the world. For medieval peasants living at northern European latitudes, this meant nights that could stretch 16 hours or more, with the sun barely climbing above the horizon during its brief appearance. Thomas and his family are experiencing what their ancestors experienced for countless generations, the terrifying sensation that maybe, just maybe, the sun won't come back at all. That winter will simply continue forever until everything freezes into eternal stillness. You can feel this existential dread in the cottage's atmosphere, even though no one speaks of it directly. Medieval Christianity had built festivals around the solstice, Christmas falling just after it, partly to give people hope during this darkest time. The promise of Christ's birth bringing light into the world wasn't just spiritual metaphor, it was desperately needed psychological reinforcement that light would indeed return, that the sun would begin its journey back towards longer days. But you're not at Christmas yet. You're in those grim days before, when the darkness seems infinite and the cold has settled in with the permanence of a conqueror who's won the war. The temperature outside has dropped further, probably into the single digits Fahrenheit by now, and even inside the cottage you can feel the cold's aggressive push. Your breath is visible when you exhale, forming small clouds that vanish into the darkness. The fire's coals give off minimal heat, carefully preserved to last until dawn, which means everyone is enduring the coldest hours on body heat and layers alone. Thomas lies awake, you can tell by his breathing pattern, and you wonder what thoughts occupy a medieval peasant's mind during these endless hours. He's calculating, probably, how much wood remains, how much grain, whether the stored turnips in the root cellar are freezing despite the straw packed around them, whether the family can make it to spring without someone dying. These aren't abstract worries. They're survival mathematics, and one miscalculation means death. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually felt time differently than we do, whether these long winter nights felt eternal to them in ways we can't quite grasp. Without clocks, without any mechanical means of measuring hours, time became elastic, stretching during dark, cold nights and compressing during busy harvest days. Some scholars suggest that medieval peasants lived in what they call task time rather than clock time, measuring duration by activities completed rather than hours passed. So this night isn't 10 hours long, it's the time between last light and first light, which somehow feels different, more organic but also more oppressive. The solstice period brought its own traditions, many of them pre-Christian in origin, but adapted and Christianized over centuries. The Yule log, a massive piece of wood chosen to burn through the longest night, was lit in wealthier households, though peasants like Thomas couldn't afford to burn such a large log all at once. Still, the tradition existed in modified form, choosing the best, densest log for the solstice night, something that would burn long and provide maximum warmth when darkness and cold were strongest. Some families marked the solstice with special foods, if they had them. A bit of preserved fruit, perhaps some honey mead, anything to make the longest night feel less like endurance and more like observance. But for most peasants, the solstice passed with little ceremony beyond silent gratitude when they survived to see the days begin lengthening again. The real celebration would come later, at Christmas, when the worst psychological burden had lifted and people could believe again in spring's eventual return. You hear something outside. Wind, probably, or maybe an animal moving through the village. Medieval nights were never truly silent. Wind always howled around structures, finding every gap and weakness. Animals prowled, dogs, cats, rats, sometimes wolves in hard winters when they came close to human habitation seeking prey. And occasionally you'd hear other humans, someone tending livestock in a barn, a night watchman if the village was large enough, or darker possibilities like thieves or worse. Medieval peasants believed the longest nights were when evil spirits were most active, when the barriers between our world and the supernatural realm thinned. The darkness itself seemed malevolent, pressing against windows and doors seeking entry. This wasn't just superstition, it was the psychological reality of existing in near total darkness for 16 hours, your mind playing tricks, every sound potentially threatening. The Christian Church taught that prayer offered protection, so families might recite Ave Marias in the darkness. The familiar Latin words a shield against both real and imagined threats. Agnes whispers something, a prayer, you think, though you can't make out the words. Medieval mothers carried enormous burdens during winter, keeping children alive, stretching food supplies, treating illnesses with inadequate remedies, and maintaining hope when circumstances offered little reason for it. The solstice period, when darkness and cold combined at their worst, must have tested that hope brutally. How many medieval mothers lay awake on these longest nights, listening to their children breathe, praying they'd all survive until spring. Here's your quirky detail. Some peasants believed that water drawn from a well at exactly midnight on the solstice had magical properties. It could cure illnesses, protect against evil, or ensure good fortune in the coming year. Whether anyone actually trudged out into the freezing darkness to draw this water is questionable, but the belief existed, documented in various medieval texts and folklore collections. It speaks to the desperation people felt during this period, their willingness to embrace any practice that might give them advantage over the cold and dark. The psychological impact of these long nights extended beyond individual suffering. Village communities had to maintain cohesion, despite weeks of seeing each other rarely, each family sealed in its own cottage, emerging only for essential tasks. Social bonds frayed during deep winter, and spring often brought conflicts that had simmered through months of isolation. Medieval court records show spikes in disputes and violence in early spring, as if people who'd been compressed together or isolated too long finally exploded when they could move about again. But there's another side to this, the intimacy forced by winter confinement. Families had no choice but to rely on each other absolutely. You learned every quirk, every habit, every breathing pattern of the people you huddled with. Modern families, scattered throughout houses and distracted by screens, can go days without meaningful contact. Medieval families in winter existed in each other's presence constantly, for better and worse. The bonds formed or broken during these months were forged under pressure we can barely imagine. Do you remember how the night began, with the family settling in and the fire being banked? That was hours ago, in a sense, though time has become strange in this darkness. You've travelled through the night with them, and now you're in the deepest part, the coldest hours before dawn, when the body's resistance is lowest and death comes easiest. Medieval people knew these hours as the wolf time, when wolves howled and prowled, when the vulnerable died in their sleep, when darkness felt most complete. Thomas shifts slightly, checking the fire without rising, ensuring the coals haven't died completely. This is his responsibility, his sacred duty as head of household. Keep the fire alive, keep the family warm, survive until morning. The weight of that duty must have been crushing on nights like this, when the darkness seemed endless and the cold inexorable. But he bears it, as his father did, as his son will, because this is what survival demands. The night presses on, minute by unmeasured minute, and somewhere outside, invisible in the darkness but real nonetheless, the earth continues its ancient rotation, tilting slowly toward a moment when the sun will begin, imperceptibly at first, to reclaim the sky. But that's still days away, and this night, the longest of the year, must be endured first. Something shifts in the darkness. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. You've been lying here in the cold and black for what feels like forever, and then you sense it. A change. Not warmth, not yet, but perhaps the absence of the deepest cold. The night has reached its nadir and is now slowly beginning its retreat. You're witnessing the first whispers of spring, though spring itself is still months away, and these whispers are so faint they might be imagination, except they're not. Thomas rises first, as he always does, his body trained by years of routine to wake before dawn regardless of darkness or exhaustion. You hear him move carefully through the cottage, his feet finding their way by memory, and then comes the sound you've been waiting for without knowing it. The scrape of the poker against stone as he uncovers the fire's coals. This is the critical moment of every winter morning. Have the coals survived the night? A breath of anxiety fills the cottage as everyone waits, still pretending to sleep but actually holding their collective breath. The scraping continues, then a soft exhale from Tommy's. Relief. The coals live. He adds kindling carefully, small twigs and dried rushes that catch quickly, and suddenly there's light again. It's just a flicker at first, but it grows, pushing back the darkness that's held dominion for so many hours. The fire rebuilds itself with Thomas's help, log added to flame, and warmth begins radiating outward in waves. This is resurrection, repeated every morning, the small miracle that means another day has been won. Agnes stirs, then the children, emerging from their nest of blankets and furs like creatures waking from hibernation. Everyone moves stiffly, bodies cold and joints aching from hours of immobility. The youngest child whimpers, and Agnes pulls him close, wrapping them both in a blanket as she shuffles toward the fire. The morning ritual unfolds with practiced efficiency. The fire built higher, the pottage pot stirred and positioned over flames to warm, the shutters cracked open just slightly to let in the day's first grey light. And there's light. Not much, just the pre-dawn glow that suggests the sun is somewhere below the horizon, preparing its entrance. But after 16 hours of darkness, even this dim illumination feels like salvation. You can see faces now, tired and pale, but alive. Everyone survived. This fact, which modern people take utterly for granted, is cause for quiet gratitude in the medieval world. But here's what you notice as the light grows stronger. It's not quite as cold as yesterday. The temperature outside might still be in the 20s, but it's not the teens, not the single digits. The wind has lessened. The snow has stopped falling. These tiny changes mean everything. Winter is still very much present. You're only in late December or early January, but the absolute worst has passed. The solstice is behind you. The days are lengthening, even if only by seconds at first. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants consciously tracked these subtle changes, or if their awareness was more instinctive, a biological sensing that winter had turned a corner. Certainly they had markers. They knew Christmas had passed. They knew Candlemas was coming in early February. They knew these dates correlated with seasonal shifts. But beyond calendar knowledge, there was something deeper, a feeling in the air, a quality of light, a change in how the cold felt against your skin. Thomas steps outside briefly, something he avoided during the night's worst hours. And when he returns, he brings news. The village spring, which had frozen solid 3 days ago, is flowing again. Just a trickle, but flowing. Water means life, and flowing water means temperatures have risen just enough, just barely enough, to shift ice back to liquid. The family receives this news with cautious optimism. One warm day doesn't mean winter is over, but it means winter can be survived. Agnes ladles out the morning pottage, warmed through now and steaming slightly. Everyone eats in silence, too hungry and too cold to spare energy for conversation. But you notice something in their faces that wasn't there during the night's darkest hours. A subtle relaxation, a release of tension. They've made it through the longest night. They've survived to see the days begin their slow expansion back towards spring. The children venture outside after eating, just for moments, and you hear their voices, subdued still, but present. They're checking on things. The woodpile, the root cellar, the path to the neighbour's cottage. Life is reasserting itself after the long hibernation of the solstice period. People who've been sealed in their home for days begin to emerge, checking on neighbours, sharing news, confirming that everyone survived. Here's your quirky detail. Some medieval villages held a tradition called first light walking, where on the first morning after the solstice, when conditions permitted, villagers would walk the perimeter of their settlement, symbolically reclaiming the land from winter's grip. It was partly practical, checking for damage from storms, looking for any problems that needed addressing, but also psychological, a collective assertion that humans still existed, still held territory, still mattered in the face of winter's vast indifference. Do you remember Agnes's exhaustion from the night? Her position as shield between her children and the worst of the cold? This morning you see her back straighten slightly. The burden isn't gone, winter continues, and there will be more cold nights, more dangerous storms, but the worst is past. Every mother in the village knows this, feels this, and in their faces you see the same careful relief. They've brought their children through the solstice, and now the days lengthen, and spring, though distant, becomes believable again. The cow is milked, her production increased slightly in the last few days, perhaps sensing the seasonal shift through mechanisms we don't fully understand. The chickens, if the family had any that survived, begin laying a bit more regularly. These are tiny changes, barely noticeable individually, but collectively they represent a trend. Life is reasserting itself against winter's death grip. Thomas examines his wood supply in full daylight, counting logs and calculating. He's burned more than he hoped during the solstice period's worst cold, but less than he feared. If the weather continues this slightly milder trend, if they're careful, if luck holds, the supply might last until spring. It's still a gamble. February can bring savage cold, and March often surprises with late storms, but the odds have improved. The village gradually comes to life as morning advances. You hear voices calling to each other, doors opening and closing, the sounds of axes splitting wood, and buckets clanking at the well. For days these sounds have been minimal, everyone conserving energy and staying inside. But now, with the solstice past and the faintest promise of spring somewhere ahead, people venture out, reconnect, confirm community still exists. Agnes takes inventory of her food stores, counting what remains: grain, dried peas, some wizened turnips, the last of the salt pork. It's not abundant, but it's something. February and March will test these supplies severely, but she's been rationing carefully, and if everyone stays healthy, no small if in the medieval world, they should make it. Should, probably, maybe. The fire burns brighter now, fully restored, and the cottage has warmed to almost comfortable levels. You realise you've stopped shivering, stopped hunching against the cold. Your body has relaxed slightly, believing, perhaps prematurely but understandably, that the crisis has passed. This is what the first whispers of spring do. They allow hope to creep back in. They loosen the grip of despair that accumulates during winter's darkest stretch. Thomas's mother sits by the fire, warming her chill-blained hands, and she's smiling slightly. She's survived another solstice. Maybe her last, given her age, but maybe not. She's tough, toughened by decades of winters, and this morning she permits herself to believe she might see another spring, another summer, another harvest. Medieval people lived without our long-term certainties, but they understood the profound satisfaction of surviving one more day, one more night, one more season. The light continues strengthening, and although it's still pale winter light, weak and watery, it's light nonetheless. The sun is somewhere behind the clouds, climbing higher than it did yesterday, staying longer than it will tomorrow. This is the pattern now, each day a little longer, each night a little shorter, winter still present but no longer absolute. You've witnessed the turning point, the moment when survival shifts from desperate to merely difficult. Spring whispers from months away, but whispers carry. You've travelled through the longest night with this medieval family, felt the cold in your bones, tasted the thin pottage, breathed the smoky air, and now, as you prepare to leave this world and return to your own, you find yourself asking the question that matters most. Why remember this? Why does it matter how medieval peasants survived winter nights that happened 700 years ago? The answer, like the warmth from Thomas's carefully tended fire, radiates outward in ways that illuminate more than you'd expect. These cold nights reveal something fundamental about human resilience that our modern comfort has obscured. Thomas and Agnes and their children weren't heroes in any dramatic sense. They didn't slay dragons or conquer kingdoms, they simply endured. Night after night, winter after winter, generation after generation, they faced conditions that would break most modern people within days, and they survived through combinations of knowledge, cooperation, and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. That's a kind of heroism we've forgotten to recognize, perhaps because it's so ordinary, so unglamorous, so relentlessly repetitive. The survival strategies you've witnessed, the banked fires, The layered clothing, the communal sleeping, the careful rationing represent accumulated wisdom earned through countless deaths. Every technique Thomas knows, his ancestors learned by trial and error, and the errors killed people. The family that huddled too far from each other froze. The family that burned their wood too quickly starved in February. The family that didn't maintain their fire died in darkness. The survivors passed their knowledge forward, and you've been the beneficiary of that terrible education, watching practices refined by generations of necessity. But there's something deeper here, something about community and interdependence that modern individualism has taught us to devalue. In that cottage, survival was collective. No one made it alone. The cow's warmth helped the children. The children's body heat helped the grandmother. Thomas's labour gathering wood protected Agnes. Agnes's skill stretching food protected Thomas. The entire village operated this way, each cottage a cell in a larger organism that survived winter through mutual support. When we romanticize self-sufficiency and independence, we forget this fundamental truth. Humans survived the harshest conditions by binding together, not by standing alone. Do you remember the darkness, those hours when you couldn't see your hand before your face? Medieval people spent perhaps 40% of their lives in darkness or near darkness. This shaped their psychology in ways we can barely grasp. They were comfortable with uncertainty, with not knowing, with existing in ambiguity. Modern life floods us with information and light, eliminating mystery and shadow, and perhaps we've lost something valuable in the process. The ability to sit with unknowing, to endure without constant stimulation or reassurance. The resourcefulness you've witnessed speaks to a relationship with material goods that's vanished from wealthy societies. Nothing was wasted in Thomas's cottage. Every scrap of fabric, every stick of wood, every handful of straw served multiple purposes. The modern world treats most objects as disposable, replaceable, fundamentally unimportant. But when a single blanket might mean the difference between your child living or dying, you develop a relationship with that blanket that's almost sacred. Perhaps our throwaway culture has cost us a sense of value, of appreciation for the objects that sustain our lives. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were happier or more miserable than modern people. It's probably an unanswerable question. They certainly suffered more physical hardship, died younger, lived with constant uncertainty, but they also lived embedded in communities close to family, with clear purposes and daily rhythms connected to natural cycles. When we look back at their cold nights with pity, and we should pity the suffering, we should also recognise what they had that we've lost. Profound connection to each other, to seasons, to the basic requirements of staying alive. The vulnerability you felt tonight, the awareness that death lurks just outside the circle of firelight, was constant for medieval people. They lived without our illusions of control, without insurance or hospitals or 911 or any safety net beyond family and neighbours. This made them simultaneously more fearful and more courageous than we are. Fearful because threats were real and omnipresent, courageous because they faced those threats every day and kept living anyway. Winter taught medieval peasants patience in ways we've forgotten. You can't rush spring. You can't force the sun to rise earlier or set later. You can't will more warmth from limited wood. You simply endure day by day, trusting or hoping that the cycle will complete and warmth will return. Modern culture celebrates efficiency, speed, optimization, but some things can't be rushed. Winter teaches that lesson brutally but effectively. Perhaps we need that reminder that some experiences must simply be endured, that not everything can be solved or fixed or accelerated. The fire at the centre of Thomas's cottage is more than physical warmth. It's metaphor for everything that sustains human life. We all need warmth, literal and figurative. We need the fires we tend together. Family, community, shared purpose, mutual care. Medieval peasants understood this viscerally because their fires were visible, tangible, requiring constant attention. Our modern fires are often invisible. We flip switches and warm air appears, we click buttons and food arrives, and perhaps this invisibility has made us forget that someone somewhere is still tending those fires, that comfort requires labour, that warmth must be maintained. As dawn fully breaks outside Thomas's cottage and you prepare to leave this medieval world, you notice the family going about their morning tasks with quiet determination. There's no celebration, no joy exactly, just the steady continuation of life. They'll do this again tonight. Bank the fire, huddle together, endure the cold and dark, and tomorrow night and the next. For them, there's no alternative. No escape into modernity. There's just winter and survival, and the hope that spring will come. But you carry something away from this night, don't you? A different understanding of cold, perhaps, new appreciation for the warmth you take for granted, a sense of connection to ancestors who endured so much with so little. The knowledge that humans are tougher, more adaptable, more resilient than our comfortable lives usually require us to be. And maybe, just maybe, a question. What fires are you tending in your own life? What warmth are you creating for others? What will you endure, and how, and with whom? The medieval peasant's cold night isn't just history, it's a mirror showing us truths about human nature that comfort tends to obscure. We're all still fighting cold in various forms. We're all still huddling together for warmth, even if our huddles look different. We're all still counting our resources and hoping they'll last until spring. The tools have changed, the setting has changed, but the fundamental human struggle to survive, to protect those we love, to find warmth in a cold world, remains exactly the same. Thomas adds another log to the fire, and you watch the flames leap up, bright against the morning light filtering through the open shutters. This fire has burned in various forms for thousands of years, tended by countless hands, warming countless bodies, driving back darkness and cold and despair. It burns still, in different forms in different places. Perhaps it burns in you now too, a small flame of understanding, of connection to the humans who came before, of gratitude for their resilience and sacrifice. The cold nights happened, the people survived, their knowledge passed forward. You're here because they endured. That's worth remembering, worth honouring, worth carrying into your own cold nights, whatever form those take. The fire burns on, tend it well. Underscore, 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 underscore. Now, let the images fade gently from your mind. The cottage grows distant, soft around the edges, like a dream you're slowly releasing. Thomas and Agnes and their children continue their lives beyond your sight, tending their fires, surviving their winters, living their human stories. But you're drifting now, warm and safe, held by your own time, your own bed, your own warmth. The medieval world recedes like tide pulling back from shore, leaving only the gentlest impression, a whisper of connection. Your breathing deepens, slows, finds its natural rhythm. The knowledge you've gained settles into your bones, not as burden but as gift, the gift of perspective, of gratitude, of understanding. You're part of a long chain of humans who've faced cold nights and survived them. You carry their resilience in your very existence. Let that thought comfort you as you drift deeper into rest. The fire in Thomas's cottage still burns, somewhere in the past tended by careful hands, and somewhere in you a small warmth glows. Appreciation, connection, peace. Hold that warmth as you fall into sleep, knowing you're safe, knowing you've witnessed something true and important, knowing that humans endure, that warmth returns, that morning always comes. Sleep now, the longest night is over. Spring whispers in the distance. You've survived your journey into the cold and dark, and now there's only rest, only peace, only the gentle drifting into dreams. The medieval world fades completely, and you're left with nothing but warmth and breath, and the infinite kindness of sleep pulling you down into its embrace. Rest well. Dream softly. The cold nights are history now, but the warmth is yours forever.